Good afternoon. Yesterday, the U.S. government, both bodies have agreed to release the Epstein files, send the bill to the desk of President Trump in order to get signed, in order for the Epstein files to be released. The question becomes what, in fact, will be released and what, in fact, is left of the Epstein files. It's going to be an
So, what are
interesting.
your opinions on is the file going to be intact or torn apart by Trump? I mean, he did have 1,000 FBI agents for 3 or 4 months now tearing apart the files. What's your best guess on this?
My guess is that somebody's gone over these files with a fine tooth comb and removed any damaging material with respect to either Trump or the Republican Party. And it's like Trump at one point said that it would be quite possible for people to insert evidence into the file in order to incriminate other people. So my guess is there's been no chain of custody for these files and they're in disorder.
Is it against the law to tamper with evidence? And is it against the law to insert documents? Now, if Trump's talking that somebody else could insert a document, did Trump himself, through his cohorts, dump information into the files? And that's a question that I guess we won't know until the files are released, but I guess we should be discussing this because it's all potential. And at what state of affairs does the Supreme Court allow Trump to interfere with personal information and conduct that predated his role as president? These are some pretty interesting topics from my point of view as not being a U.S. citizen, as what constitutes legal tampering of evidence.
One of the giant flaws or holes in the legislation that they've passed is they are not going to release any material that involves an active ongoing investigation. And Trump just ordered that there be open investigation into Epstein's connections with three prominent Democrats, Clinton, Larry Summers, and billionaire Reid Hoffman. So by ordering an investigation, he's effectively closed release of those files. Now, he may have outsmarted himself in the sense that if the investigation is limited to the people, the Democrats, then any information that would be of value to Trump can be quite rightly withheld, and any information that deals with Trump whatsoever should be released. However, if Trump and Clinton were up to wrongdoing together, then perhaps that won't be released. So it's a huge problem down in the U.S. It's credibility of
Well, I
which
mean,
Trump doesn't have any.
the early dumping of Epstein releases by the estate showed that there might be a connection between Baba, which was the nickname of Clinton, and Trump, which is hilarious, is to see what corroborating evidence is to be provided on the interaction of Clinton and Trump in the release. You'd think Trump would want any evidence in the FBI file between him and Clinton to be released to refute the allegations in the emails of Epstein's brother referring to him giving a blowjob to somebody named Baba. So that's an interesting take. I think I would want personally to have the evidence released to exonerate myself, or we're going to have a lot of redaction and missing information.
I would be shocked if the file was intact. Absolutely shocked. It's not. It would not be out of Trump's behavior to pull pieces out and destroy them, just like the Epstein videotape at the prison turned out to be missing time, doctored in Photoshop, and on the wrong cameras. And the cameras that were in the right location were not working. So,
Three
you look at
minutes of
just
missing time that's very critical. Why would you take 3 minutes of video out? And that is another issue is we now should know that Epstein corresponded with the Israelis and was an informant and worked with foreign state governments. Is the 3 minutes out because Epstein was taken out of prison, or was it that he was executed by known assassins in prison? There's a lot of questions there, and the fact that Maxwell is now sitting in a luxury resort awaiting a pardon gives us pause to think that this is a very dubious government in control and has ties to international countries that are known for crimes and covering up criminal activity. I mean, the Epstein files show the character, the morals, and the ethics of the country, the United States, and we, the world, want to see how they deal with this release, and it's in the hands of a known felon who is in the Epstein files, and that will tell us exactly the morals of the country, U.S. And when you consider about the morals of the country, I mean, how many states allow child brides? And that's raping of children under the guise of being authorized by the church and by the state to have sex with a minor. And most of these child brides are married to adult men between the ages of 20 and 29. So we see that most of these child brides are poverty, they're impoverished, and it is the rise out of poverty that allows them to justify the child bride scenario. And then you look at all these red states that do not allow abortions, which means the victims of rape and incest have to bear the child to birth. It is showing that they are the property of the men in society that are writing the laws. And this country of the United States has got a lot of moral issues that have to be addressed. And I think they are addressed when we look at what's going to happen with the Epstein file as to, is the people of the U.S. going to allow the hiding of the FBI files without questioning why they're not being released in full to the people when the House has said release them? And if there was an ongoing investigation, they would have already had charges by now levied if they had a moral justice system in the U.S. There's lots of questions, people, and I want the U.S. people to answer those questions. Give us some comments. What do you think? We know what you think, Cal.
Oh yeah, I'm sure the incinerator has been running overtime, on the Epstein files. The question is, when some of the documents disappear, has somebody made copies someplace so that those copies can reappear and then implicate the people in the destruction of those files? In other words, who did it, who ordered it? And you can imagine that once Trump is out of power, the people who have been supporting him, who are now in danger themselves of criminal prosecution and have not been pardoned, are going to be the first ones talking to lawmakers about what happened. So this is far from over.
If you commit a crime under the instruction of Trump, whether you shoot a missile at a boat, or whether you tear up a document or a file, or burn a Polaroid where Trump is sitting with naked girls of undetermined age with a cum spot on the front of his drawers that has been talked about by credible sources, and those files disappear, is that going to result in crime charges? I mean, Nixon had a bunch of people do stuff for him, and lo and behold, a large percentage of them went to jail. He might not have, but there were a lot of people go to jail for trying to cover up documents and be partisan to actions trying to cover up what went on. So this is going to be a moral issue for many of the people involved. And because it's FBI agents, can the FBI be trusted when they are the ones going to have to be the ones implicated in destroying the document? I mean, that's going to be the bottom line, is if it's in the hands of the FBI, then the FBI is destroying video and Polaroids and documents and emails. And the most important thing here, folks, is the money trail, because Epstein went 20 years without having any money trail of where his money was going and coming. The only way he could have that happen was by governments around the world backing him and by the banks backing him. And lo and behold, the minute the talk of the Epstein files looked like they were going to be released to the public, major banks came forward and said, oh, there's billions of dollars in transactions that were red flags. Sorry, we didn't bring it to the government's attention 10, 15 years ago, but we're bringing it now. And what's happened to those transactions and the investigation of those transactions? And is it going to be further hidden in the Epstein file release? Because the money laundering is not being dealt with on the Epstein file, because there was a lot of money transferring hands. So I think there's going to be a lot of questions brought up regarding the handling and release, and we can only sit and hope that the FBI doesn't follow the orders of Trump and releases all the information. That's my take on it.
Well, one of the survivors, Gina Liza Jones, apparently said she had voted for Trump. That was back in the day when Trump was promising to release the files. Her comment was that sexual abuse is not a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. She says that it's time to take the high ground, the moral high ground, and support the release of the files. Now, there's two problems, obviously, with that statement. Is there is no honest moral high ground with Trump. So I mean, you can wish, you can try to force him. You got to remember he's got the House still in his pocket, and he's got the legislature still in his pocket, and he's got the Supreme Court still in his pocket. So when he decides that, or his idiot Patel decides that it's in the interest of the investigation not to release data, that's what's going to happen. The data will not be released.
And I do believe, like you, that there's going to be no data released. He's going to stomp and cry that he has no involvement, but the facts are that the document's probably been destroyed, and that's the only reason he agreed and got out in front of it and said, yeah, go ahead, vote for the documents to release, because he knows after his closed-door session the other day that the documents were never going to be released, and that would have been what they were doing behind closed doors with their meeting with the DOJ and that. So one question I'd like to ask the U.S. citizens, and in particular bring the attention to one fact. Why on earth would Biden never bring up or pass an executive order stating that nobody can run for office in the U.S. that has a criminal record or has ties to states that are at war with the U.S. or oppose the U.S. or have ties, personal ties to terrorist organization or contact with terrorist organization, or have contact with child pedophilia rings and allegations of sexual assault hidden by non-disclosure agreements? And why didn't Biden bring a grand jury hearing into bringing the sexual assault allegations against Trump to a head by forcing the victims to come and testify as to why they made the allegations in the first place? And the same onus is, why hasn't Trump brought these victims of or allegations that were put against him to a grand jury testimony to have these women exonerate him from the allegations of sexual assault, which he paid money to, and there was a boy as well. So this is something that I'd like to ask the U.S. people. You have a grand jury process. Why are not the alleged victims of sexual assault that were silenced with hush money not brought before the grand jury? It's in private, in closed chambers, and the testimony cannot be released per se to the general public. And why isn't Trump or Biden in the past brought these people that accused Trump, 26 of them, that he committed sexual assault against them? And the monetary hush money should not be the reason that these people are not brought forward. They should be brought forward because it's in the best interest of the U.S. citizens to know what went on. Just like in the Epstein files, it is best to know and not have the cover-up. So my question to the people of the U.S. is, why aren't you demanding this grand jury to bring these alleged sexual assault victims before a grand jury to testify and give them protection against the threats that Trump would impose upon them for endangering their health? Like Marjorie Taylor Greene has been threatened now and outside of MAGA, and she's worried about her life being threatened because of Trump's actions. So when you have somebody that can impose threats on people, it's time for the justice system to step in and protect those people. So where are the grand jury indictments for these sexual assault victims to make their statements known to the people? If a crime was committed, is it not a cover-up of a crime to offer money to silence a victim so that your crimes are never brought before the people or the justice system? And I say my understanding of the U.S. system is it is against the law, and anybody buying off silence should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, which means it's against the law to silence a victim or hide testimony of a victim. And that's what's going on with a non-disclosure agreement. So people of the U.S., as part of the Epstein files, why don't you demand the grand jury investigation into bringing these women's statements to the grand jury? It makes common sense. It would clear up to the world that you're not all involved in covering up pedophilia rings and sexual assault.
I don't know. It's a long haul. It'll be interesting to see what's there and what isn't there. And of course, if something isn't there, there's going to be a presumption that it never was. So the fact that Trump's name has been mentioned anywhere from 1,600 to 2,000 times in various emails suggests that there should be something there. The nice thing about emails is they don't seem to ever really disappear. There's a sender and a receiver, and then there's a file someplace in outer space that has the information on it that can always be somehow recovered. So that will be interesting to see. Now, one of the points that you made is that the women that were involved were all young women and were groomed by various parties in order to be available to basically these very powerful men. And one of the things that you mentioned earlier too was that child marriages are still allowed in the United States, especially in the southern states. Children as young as 15 can be legally married, and apparently the national divorce rates for underage marriages is between 70 and 80%. So most of these unions don't break up early, and girls 15 to 19 are twice as likely to die in childbirth as older women. So you look at those statistics and you think, okay, this is not only a moral issue but a health issue. That there's no access to abortion in a number of states in the U.S. Yeah. And these underage children can be compelled to be married. So again, when you see something like these Epstein files arise, it's not out of nowhere. It's just part of a cultural flaw, if you will, and a lot of it is tied, at least on the surface, it seems to be tied or tied back to religious beliefs.
And that's always been my statement is there's too much religious influence in the United States, especially in impoverished states, which are all or most of the red states where Trump is getting his power. there seems to be a religious fanaticism that has the power to control the governments there. And because churches are organized people with lots of votes, they seem to be able to push their ways and rights into the legislation. And in many religious ideologies, women are property. And you're seeing it with these laws in the red states that they believe that women have limited rights and are the property of men. And that is why you have marriage certificates perpetrated by the church to say, hey, we authorize the marriages through the church, and we've made it so that marriage is part of the institution of governments, and we influence how the laws governing marriage are, and the religious component oversees the rational protection of individual rights in the case of, like you said, that younger women have more health issues in childbearing and endangers their health. And we know that the higher divorce rate is because these individuals are not mature or grown up or worldly at that age. And as they get older and wiser in the ways of the world, they tend to feel that they're in a bad situation and want to leave. Many of them can't leave because of whatever, and so there seems to be also a related high rate of suicide and death to these early marriages. So when we start understanding these religious ideologies, there was supposed to be separation of church and state, and I think one has to understand that in governance, this is becoming more and more obvious as the U.S. has turned into this group of MAGA influencers and religious rights being imposed onto the general population, like no abortions. If you're raped, you have to bear the child to birth and have no right to go get an abortion in many states. There's 11 states or something like that where you can't get an abortion. Incest, rape, you're stuck having to bear the child. And that is giving the perpetrator of the sex crime more rights than the victim of the sex crimes. And you're seeing it in the release of the Epstein file when you have a pedophile ring being covered up by the Senate. I mean, the Senate was hiding the release. All these politicians were supporting not releasing the Epstein files for years now. And all of a sudden, they had to agree that they should be released. But the underlying point is that it should have been released a long time ago or charges filed in it. And I agree with Newsom that it's a pedophile protection racket going on, or ring of politicians that are protecting pedophile acts of their president. I mean, there's no other reason to have gone along with Trump to hide the documents. And if documents go missing, there better be backups to show where these documents went missing at, and hopefully some of these FBI agents made copies and hid them away from their bosses so that they could show that there was missing documents. I don't know what's going to happen, but I guess that's why we're talking about it.
Interesting problem, but the good news is it really isn't our problem. Our problem is
Epstein traded
whether or not you can trust people.
Well, Epstein traded women all around the world, so it is an international problem, and there's poverty all around the world, and where you cut the head off of one snake, two heads appear. So there is a lot of money to be made in marketing young women, and I believe that human trafficking is still one of the biggest problems around the world. And it's being shown that you can get away with it because the U.S. has allowed the wealthy to get away with it. So it is making human trafficking more of a problem around the world because the U.S. has said, go ahead, nobody's ever going to get charged, and only one person ever got charged per se, and he got a slap on the wrist until he hung himself. if that's what happened to them. And look at Maxwell. She's living the life of Riley in a nice limited prison. So they're saying to the world that human trafficking is fine as long as you do it to the rich people. Take the poor women and traffic them to the rich guys. So I see it as a problem around the world and needs to be dealt with. And the international laws, where the U.S. fails, the international laws have to step in. These people were trafficking across international borders, and the UN and the Hague should be where people like Trump are prosecuted or brought before for a trial to see their innocence or guilt before the international community, not the perverted U.S. that is involved in covering up pedophile rings. We need to have an international court look at this.
Good luck.
Wow.
You can't even bring these people before the court of justice for mass murder. So you're not going to get them before any kind of international tribunal in any event. And nobody in America believes that there's an international body that takes priority over their own stupidity. So that's never going to happen.
Well,
Nice idea.
Need for
Like
change
it's
in
a
the
nice
US.
idea that well, that's never going to happen. Well, what we're going to see before anything like that happens, every empire rises and falls. And the question becomes, do those in an empire that is falling know that it's falling? And one of the signs of a falling empire is it lashes out. It lashes out at the rest of the world. It creates invisible enemies in order to try to bring people together to cause them to behave what more appropriately to the wealth. And if you look at the U.S. right now, what it's doing in Venezuela as an example, or what it did in Iraq, what it's doing in Iran, and the way it's been treating China, you got to look at that and go, are these people really enemies? The Chinese, the last time they invaded anybody was a short incursion into Vietnam, a long, long time ago. And the thing is, if you look around the world, most of the conflicts involve the U.S. and currently Israel. And between the two of them, they account for most of the I would suggest invasions, bombings, mass murders,
Russia has invaded a
judicial
lot
killing.
of states and sovereign countries. You got to add Russia to the list.
Oh yeah, they've had their share, but China, as an example, hasn't really invaded anybody. I mean, people say they took over Tibet, and they're saying that they're treating the people in Mongolia with disrespect. But look around. It's the U.S. and Israel that are the real bad actors. And so you're not going to get a high ground. Oh, and Russia, but you're not going to get a high ground.
The three big bad bullies on the world are Russia, Israelis, and U.S.
You're not going to get moral high ground from America. Like, the people
and I think
who
that's
oppose.
one of the things that if there was going to be moral high ground, you'd have politicians stepping forward saying, hey, we need to change our legislation, we need to improve our world image, and we need to get rid of having people with criminal backgrounds being able to run in politics, and we need to clamp down on pedophile rings that are run by the wealthy, and we need to deal with our poverty so that poor people aren't forced to be prostituted out to pay the bills. And when you don't see any of that being done in the U.S. by the opposition, and you understand that the money people pay for both sides of the coin, they pay for Republicans to get elected, and they pay for Democrats to be elected, you understand that the money runs the whole political system, and the money likes poverty because they have the ability to abuse and use poor people as working stiffs for their empires to make them nothing but money. And the minimum wage has never kept up with inflation down there. So you're seeing the money accumulate at the top, and capitalism is probably not a good thing for the world when you consider that the population is going to double in 20, 30 years, and capitalism says all the money goes to the top. That means there's going to be a lot of starvation and poverty, and what's going to happen to the world at that stage. And I think we're starting to see the ramifications of these capitalist ideas saying that nobody should have social protections in society, and you should be the victim of your state of financial ability.
Just as one example, though, the Republicans in Congress have voted down legislation that would have required Trump to obtain congressional approval for any military attacks on Venezuela. So you now have a senile madman with the most powerful military in the world at his fingertips without any kind of control or oversight whatsoever. And the people who are supposed to be responsible for that oversight are giving up their power. And that just goes to show you that, you know, the moral rot of the US and the
Well,
power of Trump.
also, it also shows you that they know they're not going to get elected in, so they're handing all their power over to one person so that they can maybe retain their positions by never having another election in the US. And depending on what's released in the Epstein file will determine the day that boots are in the ground in Venezuela. And if you want to have my take on it, Putin and Trump are negotiating behind closed doors about divvying up a peace deal for Ukraine, and they have basically come to some sort of understanding in that in the last few days. And my take on it is that Trump and Putin are negotiating, and what they're doing is they're divvying up Venezuela in the process of the negotiations, because there has to be something in it for Trump. Well, Trump will get some land deals and mineral rights out of divvying up Ukraine with Russia. But what's more important is Trump wants a deal with Putin not to supply weapons to Venezuela, because Venezuela has asked Putin to supply missiles and weapons to Venezuela. And in the negotiations to re-implement trade and remove tariffs and sanctions on Russia, you can bet your bottom deal that Trump is letting Putin know, we're sending troops into Venezuela. Please step aside, and we will not intervene any more than we already have in your conflict in Ukraine, and we will help you set up like they set up in Gaza. So yeah, so it's set up like Gaza settlement concept, which we know there was no peace in Gaza. It was just a glorified exercise so Trump could brag that he set up a peace deal, and he wants to do that in Ukraine. So my guess is when the Epstein files are released, if there's damning information released and or information is countered to provide that missing documents were intentionally taken out, that's the day that Trump orders troops on the ground in Venezuela. So that's coming sooner than later, folks. Within 30 days, Trump has to sign that the order or the law that the Epstein files be released. We're on the precipice of Trump causing as much distraction on the release as possible, and that means a war in Venezuela, folks. There's no other means of distraction that I can see that would be scaled enough to protect the Republicans in power. They want to keep their positions in the Senate and the House, and Trump wants to keep his position as president. A war would mean no elections, and at that stage, the transfer of power to the king will be done. So to make King Trump, it's a war in Venezuela, and ICE and the militias will be hitting the streets of cities all across the U.S., claiming all Latinos are members of gangs and militia supporting Venezuela efforts, and that's when you see the total collapse of the U.S. empire as we know it.
I was just looking at the screen about the US's deal with the Ukraine over rare earth. You
Yeah.
know, I wonder if that's going to factor into the Ukrainian, Russian, American peace agreement, since apparently most of the resources reside or are located, sorry, in the regions that are now occupied by the Russians. And I can't imagine the Russians giving up possession of, rare earth mineral sites in order for the Americans to fund the war against them. It doesn't seem to make
Well,
sense to
there's
me.
quite a bit of the mineral rights is still held by Ukraine, but they are in the lands that Russia wants Ukraine to give up as a part of a peace deal. But it would just be a sham peace deal that would be allowing time for Russia to rearm and take the rest of Ukraine. No, you can't trust anybody with ties to foreign states that are dubious, and Trump has ties to them that go back to the 80s and 90s, and some of this black money bailout that Epstein referred to, that Trump was broke, the money laundering that Epstein could be the financier of Trump's recovery using oligarchs' money from Russia at a time when Russia was banned from dealing business with. There's a lot of things in the Epstein files and FBI investigations that come to where did the money go, who was involved in the money, and a lot of it points towards Trump. And if those are whitewashed out or redacted or files destroyed, I think people will be wanting to know the truth about all of that, and there should be enough bank transfer actions and all these things that could show that this was destroyed documents, and then whose heads are going to roll for destroying legal documents, because it won't be Trump. He's immune because he has the power, but everybody else involved is not immune. And when and if there's a change of government, their heads will be on the chopping block. So this should be really interesting. I'm looking forward to see what's in the file.
I think it's going to turn out along the lines of a Jerry Springer show, where the parties get up on stage and yell and scream at each other and kick and fight and everything else, and unless you're into drama, nothing substantial is going to come out of it.
Well, we might find out who Baba is. Okay, on that note, I don't have much more to cover.
Talk to you later.
So make sure you share, like, make us go viral. Give us some comments. We want to hear what you think of what we're saying. Okay, bye.
Subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and please share the video. Don't be afraid to share this commercial with your friends too.